Greetings, fellow Star Trek fans, and welcome to Captain's Yacht, a Star Trek podcast run by two inner-city high school teachers evaluating the Star Trek universe through the lenses of history and literature. A little reminder before we beam aboard the Captain's Yacht: if you like what you see or have feedback for us, please like, share, subscribe, and comment, and we'd love to hear from you. So, let's beam aboard the Captain's Yacht and see what we're talking about today.
Welcome, fans of Star Trek, to episode 4 of the Captain's Yacht, the podcast that takes you on a tour of the next generation, episode by episode. Join us as we board the Captain's Yacht for a 3-episode excursion into the next generation's first season, including the episodes Hide and Q, Haven, and The Big Goodbye. I am at Scholar Beta on all things social media, and I am joined today by my co-host and co-captain, Captain Kanaka. Welcome, friend.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, again, I just want to say at the beginning of this, Captain, that we are putting this podcast together as two teachers who are doing a project ourselves and a model of some experimental learning. We are encouraging students to get out there, get messy, so to speak, get into the weeds right away with trying to figure out how to make a podcast. You and I certainly are learning a ton about editing and script writing. So this has been a great experience, and I can only hope that our students are able to explore and enjoy podcasting as much as we are. So, Captain, I'm going to turn it over to you. Anything you want to talk about before we launch into our first episode to talk about today?
Perfect. I just wanted to thank our commenters again. I've been getting a couple comments. Deeply appreciate that. I also wanted to say that deluxe episodes, small 3 to 5 minute segments of our big episodes are done with video footage spliced in. The Hidden Truth Behind Star Trek is our first deluxe episode. It's been a lot of fun learning how to edit videos. Any kind of feedback any of you more experienced videographers have would be greatly appreciated. I'm tentatively planning on doing another deluxe episode, which comes from our episode, The Naked Now, where we discuss where classic Trek succeeds, where Kurtzman Trek seems to stumble a little bit. I'm curious to see what the response is to that. Also, word to commenters, if there's anything else you think we should pursue. We've mentioned to Picard and having a day of reckoning with that. We're open to you folks, and we're learning, so we appreciate any feedback you all have on this. So thank you.
Excellent. So I think without further ado, let's start talking about Season 1, Episode 10, Hide and Q. Stardate 41590.5. This episode is all about Q and Riker, but before we get into that, let's a little premise. While en route to aiding a mining colony that has just suffered a massive collapse, Picard is accosted by Q again, this time with the intent of turning one of his own crew into a member of the Q continuum. So this is, to me, a classic Trek episode, and actually establishes a really important kind of subgenre or trope, and that is the Q episode. We're going to almost get one a season, and there's several more to go, several that are excellent, and a few that are kind of painful to get through. But This episode definitely establishes the Q episode, and some other tropes that I want to talk about a little bit later. There are some definite parts of white culture that I want to talk about that are showcased in this, especially individualism. And the other part is that concept of humanity being tested or on trial. We're going to get a little bit more of that again, and I'll chat about that. So, Captain, what's going on behind the scenes of this episode?
So this was the first written contribution of Maurice Hurley to Star Trek: The Next Generation. I've made mention to him before. Maurice Hurley was the head writer from Miami Vice and The Equalizer, both very high-profile police procedurals from the 1980s. He was hired by Gene Roddenberry's personal lawyer, Leonard Maizlish, And the fact that he was hired as head writer for the show upset a lot of Trek mainstay writers, especially DC Fontana, because as Fontana put it, Maislish, quote, never wrote a word of science fiction in his life. And we've made mention, especially with the Naked Now, on how his influence coming from the Miami Vice perspective might have affected that episode. But Hurley is credited with writing this episode. However, there's a catch. When Hurley wrote the episode, showrunner Gene Roddenberry was so displeased with the script that he completely rewrote it. And then this in turn upset Maurice Hurley to the point where he basically requested that the pseudonym C.J. Holland be used in the credits instead of his own name. So no one seems to be happy about this episode, but these 3 episodes in particular seem to be historically important in their own ways. You see a lot of major turning points in the trajectory of season 1, courtesy of these 3 episodes, I think. So this episode's impact seems to be more behind the scenes. So do you think we should get into deep cuts now, Scholar Beta?
I absolutely do. And I'm going to let you start us off. And as we kind of start talking more about Riker's character, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, I'll jump in here. So why don't you get us started, my friend? What's working for you in this episode?
So ever since I first saw this episode 20 plus years ago, I have an affection for this episode. It seems to be, you mentioned the Q episode, and this being the first quote unquote Q episode outside the pilot. And I think there's something to that. And I think getting that norm in as a staple of Star Trek The Next Generation, it's more competent than Encounter at Farpoint is. I also made the note, and I know we disagree on this, that this is one of the first episodes of the show where the good elements way more than the bad. So Roddenberry has the thesis, and one of the reasons why Gene Roddenberry wanted to make Star Trek The Next Generation, as I mentioned in our pilot, he originally didn't. But there were 2 reasons why he took it on. The first reason was money, and the second reason was he had the ability to express his thesis about humanity. And for better or worse, that thesis is on full display here. Humanity will continue to grow. Through innate curiosity and desire for self-improvement, we will match and even exceed omnipotence, because Q makes allusions to that, where he goes even beyond us, the Q continuum. And you go, okay, that, what could be beyond the Q's power? And that's an interesting concept. And again, Maurice Hurley really chafed at this idea a lot. He even went so far as to say that Roddenberry's ideas about man and humanity were quote unquote wacky doodle. That is his own quote. There is legitimate chemistry between Picard and Q. The scene in which they are sparring by quoting Shakespearean lines, I just gotta say, I come from a literary family. My mother is a retired English teacher who has an affinity for Shakespeare, and having those 2 characters go back and forth and spar by quoting Shakespeare reverberated and resounded very well in my household. So I like that a lot. The climax of the episode deals with legitimate character study that fit all characters perfectly. Riker is a man of his word. Despite having omnipotent powers, he still obeys Picard. And I know you have something to say about that, dear scholar. So what say you on that?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're talking about the part of the episode here where we've kind of skipped over the battle game part, but maybe we'll go back and talk about that in a second. But basically, Riker has been given the powers of the Q, and so this is sort of a test of Riker and kind of a test of humanity by proxy through Riker. And so, what would we do? What would you do with Q powers? How would you act? How would that change you? And at first, it's kind of interesting because Riker doesn't act very different, right? He gets these Q powers and he makes some enemies disappear. and teleports crew members around a planet / back to the Enterprise, which is really things he could already do, obviously with the power of technology and not just snapping his fingers. But yeah, I think it is a continuation of that idea that we get an encounter at Farpoint, that humanity has kind of a dark past and has been given powers and has abused those powers and has used them to do all sorts of nasty things like the eugenics war and the post-atomic horror. And so potentially, Riker could become like an omnipotent despot here. He could really be a terrible person. He could really do some terrible things, but you're right. He's a man of bond, of loyalty, of honor, very Klingon in that way. And ultimately he doesn't use his powers to destroy, to tear down, to obliterate. He actually attempts to use them to help his fellow crew members, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in my section on criticism. But I actually think the part of this that works for me is the test of Riker. Though it's just my only last thing I'll say is it's not a very long test. To test to see if what someone will do when they're a god. He basically has these powers for like 3 of the 5 acts or 4 of the 5 acts, right? And we don't really get to see him like contemplate this later or be sad that he gave them up or anything like that, right? It just to me seems like a little bit shallow of a test. Maybe we spent a little bit too much time on the planet fighting those pig, ape, French soldiers, whatever they are, So, what else? Do you got anything else you're thinking about Riker and his Q-like powers? Or should we keep chatting about the other characters?
Well, okay, so having him not, so I read an article recently while I was researching this and how very much averse. Okay, so you bring up the criticism that he doesn't get to explore his powers a lot. And that is a valid criticism, especially by the landscape of modern media with long-form storytelling and whatnot. But one of the many dictums, and this is one of the few dictums and rules not set by Roddenberry, is everything needed to be resolved in each episode. You couldn't have any lingering things. You couldn't have any story threads link into episode after episode like you see today. So do they use their time effectively with that? To a certain extent, yes. To a certain extent, no. As I said, if you were given omnipotence and then it was taken away from you after only 4 acts, you'd think that'd have a major impact. I definitely agree with you on that. But nothing happened there, and I blame that more on the landscape of late 80s, early 90s television, where even events that happen to other characters are brought up and then brushed away very quickly. Even Picard's assimilation. So that is terrifying and disturbing, and you have it in Best of Both Worlds Part 2. Yes, go ahead.
You're right about that. I was thinking that there are some major things here. This is kind of an interesting transitional period in television, though, because the character who gets the longest running arc in this show, where past events will be brought up in future episodes, is Worf, in my opinion, and even Data to some extent. Picard not so much. Riker really vaguely. The Imzadi stuff follows him a little bit, but not really. And it's just, you're totally right. It is a product of its time, but at the same time, I guess I am obviously looking at this with glasses that show me through season 7, and I can see that they're actually gonna attempt to bring back some character ideas and moments and development and have them go beyond the episode, which is really interesting. It's not so much like they are not resolved in the episode, but that they kind of come back to reward fans in a way. But more than fan service, it actually has implications. So anyways, and I just think about Worf. Worf runs all the way through DS9. In the very last episode of DS9, he's doing consequential things that started in TNG. So I don't know, my friend. You're right. It is a product of its time, and I just want it to not be so much at the same time. But yeah, you can't have it both ways.
Well, unfortunately, they do reach a compromise, and when we get into season 2 and 3, we can definitely talk about that. But you bring up Worf and the many arcs that the arc to his character, it actually starts here, I would argue, because you bring up DS9 and Worf, for those of you who haven't watched Deep Space Nine, he actually gets married at one point.
Yes, sir.
Satisfying the arc or concluding the arc that has started here with Worf getting a mate. This comes out of left field entirely. This happens during the climax of the episode where Riker attempts to give characters what he thinks they want.
Yes.
And because Worf is quote-unquote forsaken by his culture, Riker attempts to bridge that gap by providing him a mate. Again, left field, but it definitely does a lot of the heavy lifting towards what's going to be paid off. My goodness, 8 seasons of him? More than that even, because you got 7 seasons of Next Gen, and then he came aboard season 4 of Deep Space Nine. Yeah, so that's 10 seasons.
Yes, 3 full seasons of DS9 plus. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Lot of heavy lifting, and that's why I have a soft spot for this episode, because they have those moments where they set things in motion that get paid off in some cases 20 years later. My goodness.
Yeah.
So I got a question.
Shoot.
And then we can run by this. Did you get the impression there was an attempt to build a relationship between Worf and Yar during that scene?
That is interesting. You asked me that. I am watching very closely for relationships in this show, because it's something we're going to talk about in the next episode, Haven, because it's all about relationships. And I totally didn't see this. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering if you're right, if they were going to maybe start giving Tasha maybe some more kind of like aggressive, kind of like not Klingon qualities. We already know she's kind of breaking stereotypes. She's a woman in charge of security and defense, which you don't get very often in television. And I suppose that could be appealing to Worf, and that they could kind of come together in that way. That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that too much. Okay, let me ask you a question. I'll put you on the spot, and I know that didn't give you a satisfying answer, but do you think it makes more sense thematically to pair Tasha with Worf or Tasha with Data? Or someone else? It doesn't really matter. You could pick anyone, but I'm just curious.
At this point, anything would have been better than what we got, because Yar ends up leaving the show partially because she doesn't feel utilized as an actress. So anything is better than what we got. But in terms of personality, and goals, I think she would be better off with Worf than Data, given the choice, because they both. Go ahead.
No, it's just interesting. No, go ahead. No, finish your thought. I like it. I like it.
They both so they both have a sort of warrior mentality. You brought up the whole breaking stereotypes thing. If I may use the term, perhaps tomboy mentality. Worf's biggest complaint on Next Generation is that there wasn't a female on the crew that was strong enough to handle Klingon whatever.
Yes.
And that's come up a couple times in the show. And if I were to pick a character who could remotely reach those and match those criteria, it would be Yar. It would not be Troy, although they try to shoehorn a love triangle in season 7 with Riker, Troy, and Yar. But I would say, Riker, Troy, and Worf.
Yeah.
But I think Yar, given the choice between Data and Worf, I think Worf would be a better fit. They both more or less want the same thing, and they both serve as security officers. So, yes, you had something?
I'm going to get into some criticism in our next discussion in Haven about making a central or early storyline about women romance or them getting in relationships. It's not like we have a date, we get a character episode for a man and then it's all about him getting into a relationship. So I guess I'm kind of like, I asked that question not as like that's the only place her character could go, but of sort of of the hints or teases that they show us I was just kind of curious. Data is kind of like not Data's. I guess I kind of see him as changing. Obviously, he's going through his process of becoming slightly more human. And Tasha isn't really going through that. She's going more through like a healing arc, finding a family, so to speak. I guess Data's kind of doing that too because he's a bandit. That's why I thought they joined. They made maybe some sort of sense thematically, though I guess Worf's doing that too. Yeah, you had an idea.
But the only reason I bring up this theory at all is because the Klingon mate materializes, attempts to, shall we say, solicit Worf, takes a look at Yar, and then she winds up to strike Worf. And I guess, I don't know, I don't want to read into that any further than I have to, but this whole would-be violent altercation starts because she sees Yar, and I think the implication is Yar's competition. So,
nice
from that perspective. So, yeah. Wesley having superhuman intelligence, but being too young to be taken seriously. I think that's a good point there. There's a serious left turn from what Crusher was expecting in that scene. I will always maintain, and I'm curious to see what your perspective is on this, Scholar Beta, that Dr. Crusher thought Riker was going to bring Jack Crusher back to life. I thought that was what was going to happen. And I think that's what she thought was going to happen. Data wants to be human, but wants to do it in a, forgive the pun, organic way in which he naturally understands, there you go, naturally understands why humans do what they do instead of having it given to him. So in other words, the quote-unquote destination of being human is not as important as a journey he takes to get there. Plus, I think from a logistical standpoint, actually making Data human and filming scenes where he's human and he's not, it's just too much time and too much effort to do. But it's nice when you can make logistics and characterization blend so well. So that's what I got for what's good. Did you have anything else, Scholar Beta?
Yeah, because we kind of started this conversation off by saying that this is one of the episodes that will establish the Q episode trope or kind of subgenre or episode type, whatever you want to call it. And something that I think comes out in those other Q episodes that's established here that I like is that Q is really masquerading as some type of wiser judge of humanity, but in reality, he's not at all. I think this really shows that in reality, he's more down to mess with, tempt, and toy other species. And that's definitely confirmed later. But I definitely get that with him making a bet with Picard. Like, that's almost what he's more interested in than the actual mission of recruiting a human, aka Riker, into the continuum as a further test of humanity. Yeah, so I think that's cool. It kind of shows, it kind of reveals a little more of the man behind the curtain when it comes to Q. Is it really this like judge of the galaxy who's determining if humanity's ready to keep going? Or is it sort of a little baser than that, shall we say?
Definitely. One other thing to add there, I have this discussion with Star Trek fans a lot, and a conversation I had last week dealt with Q always representing chance and the random element. And while I was having this conversation, chaos theory was brought up and how Q could be a thematic extrapolation of chaos theory, which was started in the 1960s when the original show came about, but then began to mature as a professional discipline by this part in history. So seeing Q as an extrapolation of that, if you want to get thematic, he's Loki. A lot of students that I've had in class make comparisons between him and Loki. I think that's very well done.
Interesting. Nice.
Yeah. So there's definitely a lot to be said about Q. You can take a look at Q from multiple angles. You can take him at face value, or if you want to get really deep into his character, there's a lot to see, as opposed to other villains and characters in Star Trek. So that's what makes him so fascinating. So with all that in mind, would you like to get into what doesn't work about this episode, Scholar Beta?
Yeah, I've got a couple points, and maybe I like your take definitely on this first one for sure, because this is where we kind of disagree. I feel like this is a worse, less serious version of Encounter at Farpoint, and I'm thinking about this really structurally too. We Enterprise on a mission, interrupted by Q, must prove themselves to Q or the Continuum. The end. And I see this as kind of an episode of testing Riker to see what decisions he'll make, and as an extension of kind of testing Picard in that first Encounter at Farpoint interaction with Q. What do you think about that? Do you think am I overgeneralizing the similarities? What's your take on that?
No, I think that's very well done. The one thing in which I think Hiding Q does better than Encounter at Farpoint is it does a little bit more to the characters with less of the runtime.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Encounter at
Yes.
Farpoint was a supposedly 2 hour TV movie, and that episode had a lot of other heavy lifting to do too. They had to establish the world, the landscape of the galaxy, and very little was issued to characters. In terms of it having the same basic plot, I think that is a good catch. And in terms of humanity proving itself, also a really good catch. But the one thing in which Hiding Q does it better than Encounter at Farpoint is definitely the characterization and what each character wants, how they interact. Almost every character has its own moment there. Yar has a moment. I'm going to venture a guess to say that this is one of the last big moments Yar does when she's in the penalty box.
Penalty box, yeah.
Yep. So
I like your point a lot about the runtime. You're absolutely right. It basically communicates the same thematic ideas in half the time. And I will definitely give it props for that. Because like we talked about, that Encounter at Farpoint episode does kind of drag for a little while there, especially in the middle. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about individualism versus individuality. It's something that great Dr. Cornell West talks about. And really, to me, maybe I'm just like overreading this. I want to get your thoughts on this too. So the way I understand it, individualism is an ideology. You know, it's this idea that the individual can stand apart from society. And individuality is more of your unique story, your characters, your characteristics, what makes you, you, the experiences you've gone through, the abilities, skills you have, stuff like that. And I feel like people use these really interchangeably, but it's that ideology thing that I want to talk about. So this episode, at the climax, we have Riker attempting to use his gifts to improve the lives of his crew members. Like you alluded to, he gives Worf a Klingon mate that Worf rejects. He gives Geordi his eyesight, which Geordi rejects. But will later accept, but not from a god. He gives Wesley, 10-year boost or a 15-year boost or something like that, which Wesley rejects. And he offers to make Data human. Data rejects that idea. So it's the Wesley one I want to point out on, because I think this really highlights some individualism at work here. Wesley says, I just want to get there on my own, honest, with the implication being, I don't want help from God, you know? So we're not ready to directly receive help from God, nor become gods ourselves. It's kind of the message I'm getting out of this, but also, even if God wanted to lend us a hand, it's more righteous and in line with humanism or Starfleet philosophy to just do it ourselves. And I just think that's a little too simplistic. You know, we need others to better ourselves. I mean, you and I are teachers. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not like you and I are the only dispensers of knowledge, but it's the community where we learn and explore and make podcasts together and have discussion and can see ourselves as models for other people and other people as models for ourselves. We need each other. You know what I'm saying? I don't think we need a godlike entity to like accelerate our development necessarily, but I just am worried that this kind of message it kind of really just hits individualism, you know, and which I think is kind of a toxic philosophy in our society right now.
Um, I think you bring up a really good point using the, for lack of a better term, divine intervention and how people reject that, because Roddenberry himself was an outspoken atheist, really outspoken atheist, and you brought up humanism, and there is a lot of historical evidence that demonstrates that Roddenberry, another reason Roddenberry tried to make the show was to promote humanism.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, no, I see on that, and again, taking into account the perspectives present in the writing room,
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
all those different factors at play. It's interesting seeing how all that plays out. We're getting low on time. Do you have anything else to add there, or should I get into my parts?
I'm just going to say one last thing, and it's be very careful of quoting Shakespeare. They quote Shakespeare to wrap up this episode. To thine own self be true. It's something that Polonius tells his son Laertes in Hamlet in the first act. That doesn't mean follow your own beat in life. That's not what that means. It's actually financial advice that Polonius was given to Laertes. So just be very careful about quoting Shakespeare. Try to come off as sounding like you know what you're talking about. Just, to all my students out there, be very careful. You really need to understand irony before you start quoting Shakespeare. That's all.
There you go.
Let's do awards, my friend.
Okay, very quickly, I want to just bring up
Oh yes, sorry,
Roddenberry.
yes.
Roddenberry. The thing that I don't like about this episode, and this has bigger repercussions throughout the rest of the show, especially the first 3 seasons, is Roddenberry breaks his own rules. He breaks his own rules. As I've mentioned before, there were 30 writers on Star Trek The Next Generation, and that turnover was so high because Roddenberry had a very rigid set of instructions for what writers could and could not do. And the thing that he says is there can be no conflict between characters. There is conflict after Riker gets Q powers. And the irony, we're talking about irony, the irony here is that Roddenberry essentially ghost wrote this episode. He jumped Maislish's credit and he wrote it himself. So this sets a precedent that it will eventually lead to Maurice Hurley leaving the show, because he's going to try to hold writers too, because eventually Gene Roddenberry is going to take a leave of absence from the show, and Maurice Hurley is going to be in charge specifically during season 2, and he's going to try to hold firm to those commandments that Roddenberry has, and then Rick Berman, who's a quote-unquote Roddenberry disciple, is going to overrule him or undercut him, and that leads to Maurice Hurley leaving the show. Just wanted to bring that up because this is one of those firsts. Many firsts happen in these 3 episodes, and that's one that definitely has impacts beyond the scenes. So, Trek first and facts real quick. We see a Klingon female with prosthetics for the first time. Keep that in mind because Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, comes out in 89. This is 1987. Also, The Undiscovered Country comes out in 1991. So, interesting
Another
thing
Hamlet
there.
reference.
Yep, it is. So, my award here is a new one. It's called Consistency. What's that? It's an award given to a story detail or character action that is inconsistent with what is previously established or what will happen in the future. Q promises to leave humanity alone after Picard's bet, but he comes back. I'm not complaining. Many of the great episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation have Q, but I'm just pointing that out. So in the time we have left, Scholar Beta, let's talk interiors.
You know, there's only one. There's only one interior featured in this episode, and that is the bridge. Let's take a look at it. It is a beauty. It is, I call this thing the Grand Marquis, of starships. My grandpa drove a Grand Marquis. I may or may not drive his former car. And it's like you're driving down the highway on a couch. And that's what I love about this bridge. It is super comfortable, but also when they get into a tactically demanding situation, everyone's at their station. Everyone's got a role to play. There's plenty of room for that to take place. Plenty of room for each character to have a station and also shine in the episode. And the lighting on it's very beautiful. You can see everything. It's quite even. I know that's more of a television thing than a movie thing. And when we get the Enterprise D bridge on film, it'll become much darker and harder to see. I just think from a fan's perspective, having it all lit up and we can see all the details and we know where everything is, that just makes it so much more exciting. So just want to shout out the bridge. Obviously, we spend a ton of time here, but this is literally the only Enterprise interior for this episode.
That's very true. All right, are we ready for beam out?
I think so, my friend.
This concludes the light version of this episode. On behalf of Scholar Beta, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please stay tuned for deluxe versions of this episode, in which video footage will be interspliced with our commentary to enhance our podcast experience. With all that said, thank you very much for the support. Any feedback you give is appreciated because it helps the kids. And with that said, live long and prosper. E malama pono, and we'll see you next time.